Hi, this is Joe Banye for Fastpitchpower.com. In today's video I'm going to talk about something that's really important for both hitters and pitchers, and that's the ability to keep the front side closed during the swing or windmill delivery. For fitness trainers, I'm going to give you a general review of the mechanics that we're looking for, so you know how to communicate with your athletes. If I'm a lefty hitter, and what I don't want to do during my swing is let this lead hip or lead side fly open too early. For pitching, it's the same. All right, as my stride foot contacts the ground, if you're working with pitchers, this front side has to stay stable to allow the trunk, pelvis, torso to rotate into it. But most importantly, you have to maintain control. What you're not looking to do, you're looking to prevent, is once this stride foot hits the ground from this front side flying open. You can see the consequence from here. If I'm in a good position, my stride foot hits the ground and my front side flies open, it throws my upper body off, and mechanics and command is lost. So that's a general review for fitness trainers of the importance of front side stability in both hitting and pitching. There are certainly a number of drills that you could probably institute to improve control of that front side. And you can improve an athlete's technical capacity, but I'm here in this video to tell you that you might be fighting an uphill battle if that athlete has physical limitations that don't allow them to abide by the same rules as everyone else. What allows the front side, the front leg, to act as a stable post is not just stability or strength of the front leg, or control or skill, or your athlete's ability to learn. Okay? It's mostly determined by functional range of motion in this lead hip. Specifically, the ability of that hip to allow the upper body to rotate on top of the leg. Ankle joint moves, allows extension, flexion, extension, moves inward and outward, and a little bit of rotation, not much. The knee joint is more like a hinge joint, and it bends and extends, doesn't rotate very much. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint. So it permits the pelvis, which sits on top of that leg, the ability to rotate, bend and flex side to side, and rotate on top of it. It allows my upper body to spin on top of the hip. The front side, yes, the front leg remains strong and stiff, but the pelvis and upper body rotates on top of that post. If the hip doesn't permit the athlete to rotate enough to perform the skill as it's being coached or instructed, there's no chance the athlete can acquire that skill. There are a number of reasons why that front side flies open. Hopefully I can show you the ways in which physical limitations in the hip can really restrict acquisition of that skill. And it's not just your athlete's overall strength or ability to learn or acquire that skill. The hip has end range of motion. It doesn't rotate all the way in or all the way out. There's an end. There's a point at which the door is closed inward and the door slams shut outward. And when things slam shut in the hip, bones collide into bones, and structures run into structures, and bones run into labrums, and there's a ton of friction. Again, if my hip is in this position and I turn my upper body into the hip, I'm slamming the door into internal rotation, or I'm approaching that door being shut into internal rotation. Some athletes, all right, I'll start with the majority of athletes. Majority of the population going to have about symmetrical internal rotation into about 45-50 degrees. Symmetrical external rotation or outward rotation, 45 to 50 degrees. There's a significant percentage of the population that are going to be limited bilaterally on both legs, internally, maybe, and then they have a ton of external. Then there's a percentage of the population that are limited in an external and have a ton into internal rotation. Okay? So everyone's a little bit different. In some athletes, some individuals, they will be limited, and they have free range of motion on one side into external, and then they're limited into internal, or the opposite. They're limited into external, but they can rotate into internal. Again, I'm looking at range of motion in the hips, the ability of that hip to spin. Worst case scenario for a rotational athlete who lives upon this ability to spin into, it needs to exhaust available range of motion, triplanar or three-dimensional range of motion in their joints to perform skills at an elite level, is an athlete with limited internal rotation range of motion in the lead hip, okay, for activities like throwing or swinging. This is what happens. If you set your athlete up in this position, okay, in which in most athletes the door is already slightly turned in, okay, because when they point their feet in, they're likely going to turn their knee in, which is just a representation of their femur rotating inward. So they're already starting in an internal rotation range of motion. They only have maybe 20 to 30 degrees left, okay, which is not a lot. You know, they're going to ask the rest of their body to do some extraordinary things to get this done. In an athlete with limited internal rotation range of motion to start, okay, so instead of having symmetrical 45 here and 45 here, they're limited internally on that lead hip, which is going to be my left hip for the remainder of this demonstration, to 30 degrees. Okay, so there might be, you know, a 10 to 20 degree limitation. In this position, their door in this hip is almost closed. And if you now ask the athlete to perform like every other athlete, as I rotate my pelvis and I slam the door shut, some other doors have to open, okay, to dissipate that energy. Because the energy is either going to be dissipated by friction in that hip joint being insulted and injured, okay, or mechanics being thrown off. The body is going to send the whole skeleton off its axis to prevent the hip joint from being injured. Okay, so it's going to ask the foot to rotate. Foot doesn't rotate, so the foot spins out. It's going to ask the spine and everything to accept that range of motion. The spine doesn't rotate very well. It's going to fly open. If the hip can't spin, the rest of the body will. And so that gives the appearance of front side instability during swinging, okay, and then during pitching. Not me. Now, I've used the words range of motion a lot during the video. That's not synonymous with flexibility. It's not just a matter of how flexible your hips are. One thing that, again, approaches relative full available internal rotation range of motion is if I anteriorly tilt my pelvis or if I stick my butt back. I've talked about this as being a consequence for pitchers. We're always working on getting hip extension, okay, firing our glutes for maximal power, but also this is also the strongest and most stable position. This alignment, this stacked position of my hips. If I dump my pelvis forward, my pelvis doesn't, the hip socket joint, the hip socket doesn't just rotate forward, okay? It rotates over the hip, okay, and actually you get functional internal rotation range of motion. I don't expect you to understand that, but understand the consequence of the hip approximating, okay, or coming close to its end range of internal rotation range of motion. What does this mean for hitters? If I'm in a bad stance, okay, I'm in this position, and you tell your athletes to stick their butt out. I'm here, and then I stick my butt out. Now I'm in a good strong position. I've just dumped my pelvis over my hips, which are maybe lacking range of motion to begin with. I'm now going to close the door even more. Now I'm going to ask my athletes to maintain a stable front side. Okay? Door's closed, I'm going to fly open. It's all they can do. So the way you set up the athlete, both their stance and as far in joint angle at the hip in this way. Okay, so I have to make sure that I'm in a straight line from my butt through my head as much as possible. I don't want to be cued to stick my butt out too much. Okay, you should be pelvis or lower core should be kind of in neutral. And you can, this would be tucked and weak. This would be arched and dangerous for the hips. Again, this is if your athletes have limited rotation and range of motion. It's inefficient for athletes that have the available range of motion. Okay, it's most efficient for everyone. But in an athlete, in the case that lead leg is limited, these other details really exacerbate the mechanical issue. Mobility or flexibility in the hip is combated by self-massage strategies and some stretching. The control of the pelvis on top of the hip. So the habitual positioning of my pelvis and what looks to be my butt here, okay, is determined by activation of the muscular teamwork of the glutes and the core, the abdominal muscles. Strengthening these two together and loosening up the hip through some self-massage, which I like better than stretching for most athletes, will help achieve at least gain a little bit of more range of motion in the hip. However, I shouldn't have to make this connection. If this is approximating your athlete's genetic potential in this lead hip, you're going to put them at risk and inhibiting their mechanics, just ask them to turn their foot out a little bit. Okay, this is going to free up that front hip and make them feel comfortable. Here's a comparison. If you ask an athlete with limited rotation in their lead hip, okay, so if I start here and that lead hip is limited, where I get a ton over here, but this hip doesn't rotate inward, okay? If you set them up in what looks to be neutral for everyone else, and they're limited in this front side, it's the same thing as asking somebody who, has available range of motion and looks pretty normal, and asking them to hit with a front leg closed 15 to 20 degrees. You're never going to ask somebody to try to hit with a hip, okay, that closed. Never. You're going to tear up the hip, and you can try this yourself. Okay? This is not neutral. This is not your starting point for somebody with a limitation in this front hip. Okay? This might be 15 to 20 degrees an out turn in their batting stance, a little bit more of an out turn during their at stride foot contact for a pitcher, might be what frees up mechanics in the rest of the body. I hope that convinced you enough to appreciate that teaching drills and teaching skills will only go so far as your athletes are prepared and how much your athletes can acquire based on their genetics, their skeleton, and their performance capacity, their physical abilities. This video has gone so long. In next week's video, I'm going to give you some self-assessments. How to assess your hips and how to address the muscular teamwork in your core, in your hips, to free up this front corner of the body, this front quadrant of the body, to hopefully allow you to keep this front side closed a little bit better during hitting and pitching.